You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Joining us today is Dr. Catherine Pekulik. She is the Director of Political Economy and Associate Professor at Catholic University of America in the Bush School of Business. She received her PhD in economics from Harvard University and has recently published the book Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today on the Hayek Program podcast.
You're welcome.
So I wanted to start off by providing everyone with a little bit of context on the book and your research behind it. So the subtitle is The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Can you provide a bit more context to what exactly you mean by the birth dearth?
Yeah, basically, we're looking at this global trend towards lower births. And I think the easiest way to think about it for people who haven't visualized the numbers is to think about how roughly in the year 1800, or if you wanted to go back to about the time of the American founding, the typical American woman would have been expected to have 7 to 8 births. And by 100 years later, 1900, that number is 4. And then by the year 2000, that number is 2. So you can think about it kind of cutting in half over 100 years and then in half again to about the year 2000. It would have been a little under. So if you're at 2 or you're trending just below 2, which is what we're doing now, that means that the expected, it's a projection, the expected number of births that we think a woman would have in her lifetime would be lower than 2. And that is a number that doesn't lead a population to replace itself. And that's the reason it's become kind of a matter of public interest, right? The term the birth dearth, just so I don't take credit for a cutesy phrase that people have said to me, I see what you're doing there. I said, actually, it was the title of a book in the 1980s, 1987, by a scholar who was working at the American Enterprise Institute in the 1980s. His name was Ben Wattenberg, and he was kind of one of a number of minority voices in the 70s and the 80s saying, contrary to the popular belief then that population was going to explode, he said, no, actually, we will see a dearth of births. And so his 1987 book was called Birth Dearth. And so I meant to sort of, it was a nod of the head back towards that book. And so I like to say that because I realized after it was published that I really couldn't take for granted that people knew that book or had been following that literature. But it is a pithy way to refer to the current state of things. It's not a population bomb, but a dearth of births.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know that context, actually. And so why does it matter if we're not replacing the population if women are having less than 2 children?
Yeah, so I think we'll probably spend time later in this discussion talking about women's choices, and that's so interesting. I, in a certain sense, think that's kind of the we have to keep our eye on the ball, and that's really the story of where we are. But when you say, why does it matter? We have this difficulty, which is that from a social perspective, there's this kind of possibility that, I guess in the language of economists, we would say that the number of births isn't socially optimal, even if we would say that the choices that households are making are perfectly good for them. They're the right choices for them. And so what that means is sort of socially, from a social perspective, there might be an optimal number of births for a country or a civilization to have. Now, I would like to say, I'm not sure we know what that number is, and I'm not sure I would want to hazard a guess. But what I will say is that if you reach a point where the total population is shrinking, so you just think about you're in a place with 100 people and now there's 50 people. What that basically means is that you will have a difficulty sustaining the kind of economic growth that we've come to expect in the last couple of 100 years. In fact, the kind of economic growth that we think is a triumph of civilization, So that is the sort of number one reason from a big social perspective why it matters. The world population isn't shrinking yet, but it will soon if the present birth rates continue. And certainly many different countries are already shrinking a little bit. So I mentioned economic growth. Then we could certainly mention political instability. When nations feel that they don't have enough of their own, this can generate a certain kind of hostility to strangers or to other people, because there is a sort of sense in which their way of life is being threatened. And I think we've seen a little bit of that. I mean, if I'm going to this is not an area I'm an expert in, but I think the kind of like, where does this come from? This kind of rise of, we'll call it a new kind of xenophobia that was not really present in the West when I was growing up, but is more present today. So there's political instability. There's an even darker political possibility, which is that, if we go another 20 to 25 years out, we'll see countries kind of competing for immigrants as opposed to what we see now. And that will be a different type of instability. And then, the third thing, just to be complete and maybe humane, is to say that for a given population size, so holding population size constant, if you compare one society in which there are larger family sizes and another in which there are much smaller family sizes, the one in which there are smaller family sizes, there are fewer brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins. And so the sense that we have that, we're connected to each other, and that even if we disagree about this or that, there are still things that that is physically in our humanity, like not as clear to people. They may feel less connected. And so, yeah, people comment on that. And I know when I was a kid, people used to say, oh, in some places like Japan, nobody even has a cousin. And I'm not sure that was exactly true, but, it was going in that direction. And so, yeah, what does that kind of world look like in which the concept of extended family is very limited for people? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I am planning to ask you more on this topic and your book specifically, but I do want to dive a little bit into your intellectual journey first. So, Hannah's Children is a collection mostly of stories centering women's lives, women that have chosen to receive a college education, but also have 5 or more kids. And it's not a sort of book that I would expect to be reading by a PhD economist. It's not centering OLS regressions. You're not creating like a quantitative data set and giving me all the numbers. It's really like a narrative, beautiful story of the women and why they made the choices that they made. So why did you choose to do this qualitative research for your project? Why did you choose to put women's lives at the foreground and not just create or find a quantitative data set, run some regression analysis, and share the results, which is more typical?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why indeed? Let's see. Well, I think that first of all, I just say you're asking about my intellectual journey and maybe a little bit kind of how I got to that place. And one thing that it would be hard to avoid mentioning is that I spent a long time in graduate school. So, and I did that because I had kids. I mean, that's kind of the story. That's the background story here. I had 6 kids in graduate school, and
while I was
a PhD student, yeah. And that's, I don't know if I was like super explicit about that in the book, but yeah. But one of the kind of side benefits of that, and there were drawbacks in relation to my productivity at that time, and one of the side benefits of that, I think, so I spent a long time kind of just as a student. I would observe, I would see things. What happens if you spend 12 years in graduate school instead of 4 or 5 or 6, which would be normal, is that you do see a lot of trends come and go. You see a lot of trends in economic research come and go. And, when you come to graduate school, at least me, I don't want to generalize, but at least me is like, I'm going to just do the trendiest, coolest thing. I'm going to do the hardest thing. I'm going to do the thing that's most important in terms of methods, right? In terms of methods. And when I entered grad school, actually, like behavioral economics was like super, super hot. And people were talking about experimental economics. This was, it was a kind of a weird time at the beginning of what we would now call a kind of the causal inference revolution. People were just waking up to kind of like special things you could do, But then if you watch that for 12 years and you are kind of forced to take a back seat, which I was. And at the time, I didn't think of it as a benefit. I thought, oh, this is like I'm being benched, and I'm like, well, I chose this. It's okay. But I really want to get in there, and run another IV regression because I'm sure I could come up with a really cool instrument. I can play too. That was the thought. But, you kind of watch and you see, wow, these things kind of come and go, like the things, and even the professors who were really super trendy when I walked in the door, they were already like less trendy 5 years out. You get that kind of sense. You're like, what is lasting? What is really powerful over the long run? And you start to see that actually the things that are powerful over the long run are the things that really help us to deeply understand human action. So I think about that's what I think about kind of the essence of what economics wants to bring. And sure, like human action in a certain domain or certain set of domains. So I was reading a lot on the side and I was thinking, well, what's going on with this birth, thing? And of course I was having kids. I was thinking a lot about it. And so ultimately, I guess I would say two things just to wrap it up so we don't spend too much time on this. Because you and I think could probably spend 3 hours on method. It's such an interesting question for the social sciences, right? But I came to sort of two conclusions about method. One is that the regressions and the correlations, the quant stuff, which is important to do for a lot of reasons, in a sense, they're always kind of local. It's really, and actually in a sense, the essence of the causal inference revolution is to make us hyper local. You know what I mean? Meaning we're really estimating local effects, local treatment effects in a period of time. And so it's fine for thinking about how human beings respond to like pricks and like nudges and like little, because of course, what you want to do when you isolate causality and you're like, okay, how did you respond to this thing? Is you want to sort of really drill down into like what exactly just happened. And you want to pull away anything confounding, right? So your childhood and your education and the neighborhood, you want to get rid of all of that and isolate this treatment effect. And that's fine as far as it goes, but actually it does pretty poorly at explaining kind of longer term changes. And so this is true in general. This is true in terms of the things that I was interested in at the time, like labor market things and things related to kind of like life outcomes and of course, social questions and poverty. But on the flip side, we can think about the market this way too, right? The way in which sort of the neoclassical model forces us to look at basically these little perturbations of equilibrium around equilibrium. So it could do that really well, and we should learn that. But what it can't give us is like any understanding of how entrepreneurship is the driving force of the market, right? You can't get change. You can only get like perturbation around stability. And I realize this is sort of true in general. Okay, so now I'm finally going to answer your question. So then I realized like there's sort of two things you can do to get the longer term perspective. And both of them kind of drive at what we would think of as theory. One is history. I think history is so interesting. And so I'd want to mention like the work of someone like Claudia Golden, who I think has kind of helped us to see if maybe the mainstream of economics had forgotten the value of history. But there's almost been a revolution in doing like great, interesting historical work, right? So history does this for us. And then I think narrative does this for us, right? Narrative and long form interviews and qualitative work. So ultimately a way of saying this is, we actually have a good amount of quantitative data on falling births, and we know kind of what correlates at the country level. We know what correlates at the personal level, but we actually can't do it's hard to do sort of normal treatment effects because we're not, there's very few like experiments that sort of meet that causal test. And so ultimately you go, okay, all right, what could I contribute here? Hey, wait a second. Like I have a bunch of kids. I could go around and talk to people who have kids and sort of dig into these motives. Like what is going on here? And so I did. That was the final answer to your question. Is I chose to work on this in part because I thought what would be something that's lasting, really gets at kind of theory questions that help us to revise our, data that helps us to revise our theories. In that I hope could have really a lasting impact and not be sort of trendy for today.
I love that answer. Thank you. That was amazing. As someone that also tries to do more qualitative research and get at the deeper meaning behind human action, I think that it's a something that's quite difficult to do. It's not an easy method, but I think you're right. Like the trends will come and go in the field of economics, but understanding why someone is doing something can.
And without belaboring it, I mean, there's this other thing that's happened. I mean, in the time since I more or less left graduate school, it was brewing at that time, which is this kind of tendency to move away from theory altogether and really to kind of hyper focus on quantitative data, sort of big data in economics. There was this, movement. I don't know if like Raj Chetty proposed it or if he was just dragged into it, but it was just like, let's replace, Ec 10 at Harvard with quantitative methods. And that would be such a mistake, I think, sort of like there's no theory. There's just what we can see agents in this model doing today. And so in a sense, like I'm definitely putting a flag in the sand for like, no, I think this is going to be always useful and helpful. So I don't think we should give up on theory.
I'm curious, can you elaborate a bit more on why you think that? I know the Raj Chetty course was a popular proposal in Econ 101. We should just look at the data and to see what it tells us. What do you say in response to that in defense of theory?
In defense of theory, yeah. Well, I think it's this kind of question of like, do we think that human beings have a permanent nature? Are we studying something like a tree or a rock? I mean, trees are, there's going to be like microevolution, but trees are trees. They don't morph into like lions and dogs, I mean, not in any kind of time frame that we would be able to observe. So is there in the scale of things, like is there a nature to human beings? And if so, there's got to be some kind of rules and principles, things that always apply. And I think when we think about at least 200 or 300 years of, like the formal tradition of economics, where it has contributed the most insight is where it's helped to kind of formulate these rules and principles. You go like, okay, suppose people do this. Suppose they act, with purpose. They have purposes. They pursue goals, right? This is sort of like teleological approach. This turns out to be wildly predictive, right? You can work through. You don't have to assume very much, and it's wildly predictive, and not predictive in a pinpoint sense, but it's predictive in the sense that it can help you understand the trends in the world, like the tendencies. I'd put it that way. Like I may not be able to tell you like exactly how the feather is going to fall because there's wind, but I know the feather is going to fall, right? So like demand curve slope down, and that's pretty important, right? And so, so there's like a few things we know, and to just say like, we don't know them. I mean, there is nothing we know. We're just going to do regressions forever is probably, it's probably a pipe dream, but it's a kind of agnosticism about the thing that we're studying that I think is implausible. It's something the scientific mind has to recoil at. Like there was a time in college, I don't know, as a sophomore, junior, I thought, what's this philosophy thing? Like maybe that would be fun. I'm like, go take a class in philosophy. And I remember sitting in the first class, and I don't remember, who was leading the class or what the topic was, but somehow it devolved into like, could we even talk to each other? And maybe that's like a really deep and important question, but I'm sitting there like, I want to understand the world. And if we can't even, we're sitting here talking to each other, debating if we can talk to each other. and so I think that's like, come back to the point about theory. I think the humble scientific mind doesn't begin to want to understand the nature of things without believing there's a nature of things, right? And so, yeah, so I think what we see is that nature does present us with patterns, and those patterns don't always lend themselves to a perfect mathematical model, but they do certainly lend themselves to a kind of, we'll say, a kind of description and a summary, and those things turn out to be pretty reliable and so interesting. So yeah, totally worth doing.
So I have the pleasure of working with you at Catholic University, and I noticed that you have an Austrian economics poster in your office, and your
true.
book quotes Hayek and Mises and James Buchanan and Julian Simon, among others. And I know that you're very familiar with the sort of mainline political economy that we do at Mercatus. What drew you towards these thinkers? How did you find them? Did you have a mentor that was an Austrian economist? Did you discover Hayek at Harvard? How did this happen?
That's the story. That's a great story. Or it's a great question. I'm really a sort of an accidental, Austrian lover. I say, I don't know if I'm ready to say like, I'd like to claim parts of all the great traditions in economics, right? I think I would like to do that. Maybe we all do. I don't, but if in order to engage those great Austrians, I have to go ahead and label myself as Austrian, I'll do that because I think there's so much to be learned. But no, yeah, it was totally absent at Harvard. Let's see. So I first encountered Hayek, not Mises, I think, but I first encountered some Hayek in an Intercollegiate Studies Institute seminar in college. I had met somebody from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and I don't know if any of your listeners know what the ISI is, but it's kind of this educational institute that seeks to help broaden the dialogue for college students. It was founded at a time when there was concern already about whether college students would be exposed to the great texts and some of the interesting aspects of the liberty and responsibility tradition. And so, I just thought like, oh, these guys are going to, invite me to this seminar. We get to read books and talk about them. And I didn't feel like enough of that was happening in my college already. And so I thought, yeah, sign me up. There's going to be a catch. I'm sure there's a catch, but I want to come and discuss these things. So one of those things must have been some Hayek on the list. I know that I read Hayek on intellectuals in college, and I thought, this is one of the smartest things I've ever read. I mean, I remember thinking, this really explains a lot of the sophistry and a lot of the things I've come to find perplexing about my university. So I'd read some Hayek. I just really hadn't read his economics, actually. So that was in college, but I thought he was really interesting. And so I kind of had this sense. And so I read Hayek at that time. And then around that time, this is like the mid 1990s. And so at the risk of dating myself, I'll say that, what's happening overseas, I was a young Catholic. John Paul II was a pope, and, there's a lot of interest in the fall of communism. And so I signed up in college to go travel around in the eastern part of Europe after the fall, met people in Poland. I got connected with people in Poland, the Czech Republic, who were part of, this kind of emerging freedom movement. And over there, I became then exposed to the work of people like Frank Meyer, a lot of the great intellectuals from the 50s and the 60s. And at this point, now you're sort of beginning to be exposed to this whole conversation, right? And so by this point, like late college, I kind of knew like Hayek was an economist. And, I started to hear about this other guy, Mises. And, it's a kind of, let's just bracket all that. I could go on for too long, but basically it was kind of back there separately. I was in college and had begun to realize that economics was something I wanted to study more for really other reasons, had nothing to do with political philosophy. And then when I got to grad school, I just figured somebody must be doing Hayek. Like I thought, well, he's an economist, right? Like so one of these fields, I was 22 and I didn't know very much. And I thought I could do the math all day long, and I did it. I double majored in math, and I thought, well, I don't mind doing all this math theory. This is kind of fun. But there must be a field. So I actually kept shopping the fields. I thought one of these fields probably is somebody's, but I didn't even know the name Austrian at that point. So after like 3 or 4 fields, I realized that this is going to sound insane to you. If it should sound insane, and probably to some of your listeners. I remember there's a point at which I thought, I'm going to sign up for this general equilibrium class. I don't know what that is, but I'm going to sign up for that because like it's like general. And, like if it's general, maybe it's going to be like the thing that's dealing with like the big picture. And I was like, but of course, like general equilibrium was like the last is the opposite of, so I didn't know, but I did like a lot of equations and, solved a lot of that was a fun class, but it had nothing to do with Hayek. So, I was so ignorant and, like just so to excuse myself from what probably sounds so really depressingly ignorant. I mean, this was like before the internet. Okay. So you didn't go online and go like, who's Hayek and where's,
Can't just Google the answer, chat GPT it.
No. This is before all that. So I felt like a total idiot. So anyway, at some point I gave up. I thought, okay, I guess Hayek is history and, these other economists are kind of history. No one's doing Adam Smith. And so I just kind of focused on things that I thought were interesting about people. I took some macro, but there were a lot of reasons I was frustrated with that. But finally I was like, well, I think people are interesting. So let's do micro. so I just sort of gravitated in that direction. So yeah, that to answer your question fully, I didn't have a mentor. I wish I did. So that was it was just like a side hobby. It was something I thought, well, there's a lot of truth and interesting stuff here. And I wish it integrated with my main extreme economic training, and it didn't. And then I'll just fast forward and give a shout out to my current colleague, Frederick Sauté, who is a great Kerzner scholar. And when I arrived at the Catholic University of America almost 10 years ago, it was thanks to Frederick that I became exposed to others in that same line. I mean, certainly it was through Frederick that I first heard Pete's name, which sounds, and again, like, why didn't you know these things? But anyway, so Frederick has exposed me to a lot of great things. And, it was the first time I read Kerzner was through my colleagues. So yeah, I mean, your local networks and friends matter a lot. And so, yeah, I think it was in the last 10 years I first read Buchanan, to think more deeply about these things.
That makes sense. To sort of get us back on the topic of your recently published book, what inspired you to do this research and to write about this topic?
Well, yeah. So I guess it would be fair to say it was a mixture of these professional interests and personal interests, or not personal, maybe just personal experience. We'll put it that way. The professional question is pretty simple. I did my dissertation in applied microeconomics, and I did two papers on kind of theory questions related to schooling, to education. And, so education and demographics to some extent are pretty bread and butter topics for applied micro people. And my third paper was a paper on I kind of engaged sort of Becker's theory of whether or not, like, we could conclude that the contraceptive revolution had affected the demographic trends of the 20th century. It was really a micro theory paper. But I was pretty interested in that question, like, to what extent did the contraceptive revolution make a difference? Becker more or less concluded it wasn't like the big thing that we really needed to focus on. That, it was, for Becker, it was really, preferences. So basically the pill kind of just makes it easier to do what you want to do anyway. So I kind of wanted to re-examine that. We kind of had a different model there. So I'd been working on kind of demographic trends a little bit as a micro person, thinking about the theories there. Really interested in theories of the family, but frustrated with them, but interested in that. They're kind of like train wrecks. You're like, well, this like totally doesn't get at anything, but it's like the best we have. You kind of go back and forth. You're like the best thing, the worst thing. So that's kind of how I felt about a lot of Becker's work. So that thesis was like very sort of standard neoclassical work. So I've been thinking about it. But then fast forward to sort of after the Great Recession, and starting to see a lot of demographic work kind of saying, this is really kind of wild. Like, there was a kind of hit to the birth rates, like another blow, an inflection point downwards, but they didn't rebound when the economy picked up. And so there's there's a paper that I think it was 2014-ish, and like Melissa Carney and Phil Levine, it's called The Puzzle of Falling Birth Rates. So when you're an economist, looking around, you're like, well, what are, I'm working in this applied micro area. So like, what are the questions nobody gets? Like, what are the things that are puzzles? And that's what you want to work on. Right. So on that side, it was like, well, this is a puzzle. This is a really interesting puzzle. And there's a lot of puzzle pieces in there, right? Because you sort of see these diverging trends in the 20th century, married birth rates falling, non-married birth rates rising, kind of huge shifts in what we think of as family forms. So I thought, well, this is like a fun puzzle to think about. And then it was this kind of like Hayekian insight, that like a lot of what we need to learn from not focusing on averages or aggregates. And I thought, well, is there something to be gained by studying the fringe groups, so to speak, like the outliers, and that. So that's kind of what got me to. And then of course, since I had a bunch of kids, I thought, well, I know there's some outliers out there. I know there's some people who are still having kids. So wouldn't it be interesting to find out like what drives them? And could that tell us something about this general, I guess I would say kind of misnomer about costs? And so we'll get to that. But this is kind of what all the pieces that came together for me.
So many of the women that you interview are religious. And so you could argue that college educated women chose to have larger families because of their religion, and that would be true. But you also admit in the book that it doesn't necessarily tell us very much. Religion can kind of be like a black box, I think is how you put it. One of the women that you interview even admits that the reason she chose to have a large family was almost underneath religion, which I thought was a really interesting way to phrase that. So what did you find? How do you explain the underneath religion? It's hard for you even to articulate it into a question.
Yeah, no, it is. It's hard. I mean, it was hard to articulate the answer to that in a book. Although, looking back, I'm like, I could have said that more clearly now, looking back. But yeah, so I guess just it's easy to explain what I'm trying to counter by starting with I think the popular imagination. So we already know, going back to those correlative studies, the quantitative work, we already know that sort of there's a correlation with religious belief, religious practice. Really, it's more religious practice and having kids. Like we know, okay, that's kind of what we see in the data. What we don't know is kind of what's going on. And so if you were to ask the guy on the street or, like your mom over Thanksgiving dinner and you said like, well, why do religious women have more kids? You're going to get one of like two answers plus maybe some permutations, right? One is you're going to say like, you're going to get their backwards story. And this is kind of like, in a sense, this is kind of the underlying thesis of like the Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz paper about the way in which the change in abortion law led to more women having babies out of wedlock, right? So the Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz idea is like, well, there's just going to be some technology non-adopters. There's going to be people who just, for whatever reason, they don't want to go ahead and use this reproductive technology. They're morally opposed, they're backwards, they're old-fashioned. And when that occurs, like the social norm shifts, the sexual path to marriage shifts, like where we can have sex before marriage and we don't have to exact these promises of marriage. I mean, this is their whole story. And it kind of rests on this idea that at the end of the day, there's just some people out there who don't want to do the thing. They don't want to use the technology. They don't want a vacuum cleaner. They don't want a car, like whatever it is going to be. And I think that that's basically a lot of people's thought about why religion correlates with more children, basically. I mean, to like put it clearly, it's just that these are technology non-adopters. They're people who have some moral repugnance for contraception, like full stop. Like there's a lot of versions of that, but that's basically what's going on. And so they won't use birth control. And so therefore they have more kids. All right. So that's one version of it. I think the other version of it would be something maybe even a little darker, which would be some kind of like form of patriarchy or kind of oppression, kind of backward societies in which sort of male preferences dominate. And of course, we know that male preferences would be for lots of kids. They want harems and they want lots of their seed being. I'm kind of just making this a caricature. In my research, I tried to figure out if that was true. Like, do we know that men really prefer lots of kids? It's hard to conclude that we know that really, but that's certainly part of a narrative. It was certainly probably true in some cultures at some periods of time. Is it true today? Like today, I don't think we have a lot of data on that, but that is sort of, there's this dominant, like these are the two dominant ideas. So notice that in both of those dominant ideas, you kind of have women that are like not sort of ordinary deciders. So then the decision-making process is gone. They're either like being decided for on behalf of by their dads or their husbands or their church leaders, like they're in cults or something, right? They're in these patriarchal cults, and they're not choosing, or they are, just, weird people who don't like birth control or something, right? So, but either, in which case there's some other thing going on. And so kind of that's what I was dealing with. And so then when you go in, so you find out that religion has this role to play, but it's not like this role that's one of those two stories, right? So I kind of went in with this, I think, supposition, I guess, would be like something that would be informed by an economic way of thinking, which is like, okay, I'm going to assume the person I'm talking to is a human agent who like has, thoughts and ideas and values, chooses things that are purposeful. And so I was going in to find out like what's going on. Do you have 5 kids because, this is like, this is what your husband wants. Is this, and you like that. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying you're oppressed, but this is like your husband's preference, and you really, maybe the popular version of Ballerina Farm that was out there. Or, you don't like birth control or whatever. So what I ended up finding was rather that at least, again, we don't know if this generalizes, but this is the women I talked to, something really interesting, which was that they could all give me a very clear reason why they wanted to do this thing. And the reason was something that had nothing to do with either of those two dominant stories. So, nobody that I talked to said, like, I have all these kids because I don't want to plan my family, or I can't plan my family. Now, planning means different things for them, but that was not a thing that I heard. In fact, many of the women I talked to were currently or had used some kind of birth control. So they weren't like technology non-adopters, right? These are people. So what I ended up finding, of course, is that these are people for whom, we'll just say like the benefits, the perceived value of having the next child significantly outweighed the different costs that would come along with that choice. And they were able to articulate that. And then kind of bundling up those articulations together was this kind of whole story of like, this is something you would choose, and these are the reasons I might choose them. And because at least one or two of the ladies, really one, maybe strictly speaking, helped me to put other words on it completely that had nothing to do with her faith, but rather like a relationship good in her case. It helped me to build this, I think, larger story using the lens of economic thinking. So religion plays a role in terms of informing what they think is good, but then they're choosing this thing because they think it's good, and this is their purpose. And then they can really pretty accurately pinpoint, like, here's the benefits, here's the costs. And I would think of sort of maybe a patriarchal situation, or this like non-rational type of thinking is like, there wouldn't be any of that balance. There wouldn't be any of that, like somebody who's trapped in a situation, be like, this is what I have to do, a compulsion, that sort of thing. What I saw was something like sounded pretty normal, like kind of costs and benefits, and people who stopped at a certain point because the costs got too high, like health costs or things like that, but had a particular framework in which the next child was, all things being equal, a really desirable thing to do. And then if other things were not equal, finances, health, or whatever else, they would stop. So that to me seemed like a story worth telling, because it's not one of the pieces that's out there. It's not one of those pieces that helps. So it's a presently not understood piece of why women who attend church more often might have more children. And part of the reason it's worth telling is because it has, I think, pretty significant implications for we'll just say the misadventures in the policy space related to natalism. So I'll leave that right there.
I loved in the book how you compared this analysis that you just gave us to David Scarbeck's research program on prison gangs.
Kind of bizarre, but
he is a Mercatus PhD alum, so we do love his research here. But I came as was an unexpected reference in the book that I was like, oh wait.
I have a friend who, when he first read the book, he said, well, I did not see it coming. They were going to compare, women with a lot of kids to like prison gang deciders, but part of that is like, you're trying to help people put a completely different mental framework on a thing they think they understand. They think they understand childbearing. And I'm trying to say to you, I don't think you do. I don't think you actually do. And I think there are a lot of, the longer I've spent talking about this, the more convinced I am that people don't understand childbearing. Or let me put it differently, that they tend to view childbearing as something that really departs from like a rational choice framework. Whereas I think it's really, really normal. It's like a very, very normal rational choice framework. I think the reason kids are disappearing is because no one needs kids, just like there aren't horses anymore. Like nobody has a horse. Right? I think it's the simplest way to understand it. Like no one has a horse. Why does no one have a horse? Because horses are not helpful. They're not helpful. They're not useful. They're just very costly. And they're nice to have if you happen to have a fetish for horses, right? And some people really love horses and they make big sacrifices to have horses, right? But you see that if you say like, no, kids are not like horses. They're there's something you have to have. There's something that, or like you're biologically programmed to have children, right? You're actually thinking like Malthus. Like Malthus basically thought that like kids were just going to happen. And they were going to happen with such reliability that like we would always breed up to the limits of our resources, right? And I don't think I got, of course I have this long description of like, here's why I think birth rates are falling. Like it's a demand story. We don't need kids, but it's much more effective to just come out and say like, you haven't seen any horses lately. And that's because people are very rational when they choose whether to have a horse or not, right? And so apart and aside from like personal fetish or some other reason, like you are in a horsey culture, like you grew up around a lot of horses and you're like, they're such a great part. But see, I'm kind of joking, but I'm also really kind of not, right? Like I'm afraid of horses. They seem like really big, scary animals to me. I think they're beautiful, but from a distance. But you know what I just said, that's how a lot of people view kids, right? They're like beautiful from a distance, kind of scary to think about actually owning one or having one. And so I think it would be really helpful if we thought a lot more. So this is going back to Dave Scarbeck. You're trying to communicate to someone like the whole way you think about childbearing is wrong. I think Dave Scarbeck's work is so cool. One of the things that I hoped some of my readers like on the margin would think like, that's really cool. Let me go read that book by Dave Scarbeck. But it's so cool because that's what he does, right? He helps you into that space where he goes like, whatever you thought about what's happening in prisons or how order emerges or the ways in which we organize ourselves. Like I want to give you a completely new way to think about this. And I think is so powerful. Helps people to understand that not all sources of order are things that come top down. And so effective. So yeah, I used it because it's cool. It's great stuff. I really hope some of your listeners and some of my readers will pick up Dave's work, which is so great. I was certainly inspired by it when I read it. And then, yeah, but it is jarring. Yeah, it's a funny sort of thing. But I think the root of it is something that's not based on prisons or childbearing. It's this really fundamental insight about what we think human beings are. And they're deciders. And that ultimately they may be misinformed. Like they may have errors about like the value of something. It's complicated to talk about that, right? But that within their own framework of how they think about the goods and the bads, we could say, or the goods and the costs, they are always choosing what seems to be good to them and the balance of the goods and the costs. People will say that that's economics or that's rationalism, but it's actually something that comes from the ancient philosophers. It's very Aristotelian. And I think it's hard to get away from it. I think it's compelling and true.
There are a lot of reasons women might choose not to have kids. And so I'm going to throw out some of the more popular ones, things that I've heard mentioned, and I'd love to get your thoughts and responses to them. So one is access to contraception. We have lots of different types of birth control. Obviously, this makes it easier, lower cost to not have children if we're having sex. So therefore, we will see less children. Another is women joining the workforce. They want to work, they want to have careers, they want to have jobs. They do this rather than choosing to have kids or in place of choosing to have kids. Another really big one is just raising children is really expensive. Housing is really expensive. Is it just too expensive to have kids? What are your thoughts on these sort of popular narratives that we hear in today's culture?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think each of those stories has some part of some explanatory power, and I think each of them fits into a greater amount of, or contributes more explanatory power as long as we come back to this idea of women as deciders. I mean, and again, of course, I don't want to abstract from like the couple's decision-making process, which I think often a lot of contemporary research does pretend like there isn't a couple deciding. And of course, usually there's a couple deciding, not always. But actually, I think that one of the ways in which we get around to, I think it's okay to say it this way, there's almost a kind of shame that we can see is put on people when they decide not to have children, right? We're grappling with that a little bit today, like women who choose not to have children. we put it that way. And we see how normative this like sense that women ought to have children can be. We could think about like J.D. Vance's, childless cat ladies comment, which, it's certainly paid a lot of dividends as a joke. Whatever he ultimately meant by it, was unfortunately taken as it was taken to really insult a lot of people. And I think that's, for me, that like that's the problem, is sort of like as if like the norm here is like women are just popping out babies. And so if they don't pop out babies, we have to understand something's gone wrong. So I think the starting point has to be like, why would you have a baby? What are the reasons that would draw you to having a baby? And then you can kind of go back through these different pieces that you mentioned. The last thing you mentioned was cost. Like, is it too expensive to have a baby today? I think that I think the best way to think about it is that, like, on the margin, some people do feel squeezed by high housing prices, and certainly urban. A lot of young people start out life in urban places where they have good jobs and it's like fun and great to live there. And then they're there making decisions about starting a family, and they're like, "Whoa, wait a second! Like I can't fit another kid into this teeny weeny little apartment." And so there's, on the margin, there's that sense that like having a kid is expensive. But again, when we look at like economic history, we know our grandparents had like, 4 kids in these tiny little like whole houses that were smaller than most of our apartments. And, like everything was more expensive, at least if we think about, Julian Simon's work and the sense of like time prices. I mean, look, overall, capitalism has delivered to us a world in which the actual costs of having children in terms of our income relative to our income is much, much smaller. So it could be that people feel that it's expensive because they're like, well, but I also want to have all these other things. Like, I'm used to having my lattes and my second car, like all those other things. And I'm not trying to make those things sound not valuable. They are. But, 100 years ago, maybe there were fewer things vying for that little bit of income that you had. But we do know objectively, in terms of following the cost of raising a kid, objectively, it's not worse today than it was before. It's easier. So there might be a perception problem, but we don't think generally like what's happening is it's just like everything's gotten cheaper, but like kids have gotten more expensive. There's like some nuance to that, but we don't really think that's ultimately what's going on, even if perhaps there's some perception there. Back up, I think other thing that you mentioned, careers, women wanting to have careers. And I think you also mentioned birth control. So I think those two things go together. I mean, so as an economist, we know that the major inflection point of married women working and choosing careers was after the birth control pill, hormonal contraception. There's lots of contraception before hormonal contraception. It's just that this is like a lot better. Right? At least be clear. It's like more effective, and it is reversible, right? It's like, and it doesn't require, let's say, like, at least it doesn't seem to require a lot of relational distress, right? So in the past, like if you really got to a place where you thought like, I don't want kids right now, or, there might be like longer periods of abstinence or other things that seem like relationally challenging, let's say. So, okay, so you have hormonal contraceptives, like, okay, we could just be together for 10 years and not have a child. So I think the way to think about what birth control does is it's not that it devalues having children, but it adds another option to the table. So, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that like we have these options. So then what happens is I think that what we've seen in the data is that most women starting out life would say, well, I would like to have a family. I'd like to be married and have some children, but I would also like to, fulfill these educational or career interests and work for a while. And that it's kind of like not that complicated. You're like, well, if you like chocolate and vanilla, you have a little bit of both, right? So people like to have some kids and they want to have a career and they want a little bit of both. And so what you see there is this kind of sort of standard, kind of maybe messy in real life optimization problem, which is that they're choosing a little bit of both and they have fewer children than in the past. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I think that's a separate question, but I don't think that's really, so I do think the contraceptive revolution made it facilitated this shift, but not so much because like, I guess your first question maybe made it sound a little bit more mechanical in the sense of like, okay, you've got people, in a certain number of relationships, you just add some, like dose them with some contraceptions, like less babies pop out. There's some sense in which that may be part of the story. But I think the richer story there is that it brought to the table of human experience another set of things to choose from. And right away, when we look at the narratives of American women in this country, like right away, women thought, that sounds great. Like, I'd really like to have a little bit more control over when I begin my family and so it was eagerly adopted. I mean, the pill diffused through American culture and society very quickly. And we saw this big shift of women finishing college and going to graduate school. And again, I refer to Claudia Golden's work there. We know it's had a tremendous impact. And I don't think it's right to think of that as kind of like, which you hear sometimes in conservative or circles on the right, you think of this as like a big plot to devalue the family. And I'm not sure that that's the best interpretation of this. In fact, I think it's a little bit weak. I think the better explanation is that you bring more options to the table. They're perceived as good by people. I think they are good. And then you just kind of see this like collision course of, I'm not sure which one to prioritize. I'm not really sure that I know which one to do first, right? There's that issue. And then there's been some learning. And I think that's maybe the most interesting part about it is certainly my decision to start having children in grad school is based on watching the generation above me and seeing, wow, a lot of people kind of like did the thing where they went to grad school, like got tenure and then started their families at 38 and then didn't have enough time. And so I think maybe it's fair to say there's like a learning process and that maybe today there's a pretty live conversation about like what's happening where people who really do want families might need to like step outside of the script and start earlier or spread more awareness, just real facts about when you're fertile, when you're not fertile. So yeah, is that too much of all those different things that you raised? But I guess fundamentally, I'd want to come back to, rather than framing the question as why women choose not to have children, as if it's sort of like automatic, I think that builds in a Malthusian assumption about women and households, which I fundamentally, at this point in my career, I fundamentally reject that. I think it's much more interesting and fruitful to ask why people do have children.
No, I love that reframing. It makes a lot of sense to me. And when you were mentioning following a script, there is sort of a lot of talk. I'm 31. A lot of my friends are around this age. They're deciding whether or not to have kids and to start a family. Part of the script is that if you have kids, both parents are super involved, which like the dad has to do a lot, the mom has to do a lot. You have to be financially stable. You have to have enough money to put the kids in either really nice daycares, really nice schools, really nice extracurricular activities. They have to play soccer and speak Spanish, and they have to be set up for success later in life so they can get into the right colleges. And I think that one reason why many women hesitate is because they see this sort of collective conversation happening and they're like, I can't provide that yet, so I have to wait. How does this view compare to the view that the women in your book had and the stories that they told you? And do we need a cultural shift on how we view children and child raising as part of the solution? I liked your point about active conversations and learning, and I think that is continuing to happen as well.
Right. And I'm excited to be part of that conversation. It's one of the reasons I didn't exclude my own story from the book altogether. I mean, it would have been dishonest to exclude it entirely, right? So I didn't want to be dishonest. But also part of the reason I included it is because, like, I think it could be a great gift to younger women who are professional and want to develop their contributions. It can be a great gift to be like, actually, you don't have to wait till you get tenure to have some kids. Like, you could have one in grad school. It would be fine. Like, it would work out all right. I mean, yeah, you won't publish 10 papers in grad school, probably, unless you're Clara Piano, like, who is just a shout out to another person who's certainly Mercatus adjacent. I don't know if she was a fellow, but she's like so incredibly productive. So I wasn't as productive in grad school as she is, or she was. But in any case, I mean, the point is like, yeah, it's great to put these things out there. Your question, what is needed, like a culture? I do think, I think just help, beginning to sort of spread that awareness. I think the women in the book, you asked, what did the women in the book view it as? I guess I would say So two things. One is, I think the thing that you articulated is very real. Women who are naturally drawn to excel, to achieve, to study, all the types of things that are necessary to pursue, say, graduate school or profession of some kind. And we know, the labor market looks very diverse, and not everybody does, but those are exactly the same kind of people. Like, they're kind of looking at like, well, how do I do parenting best? And now best looks like that. It looks like all those things. And you're really describing, I think, what I don't love Gary Becker's work on this, but I think he's right on a sense, like this kind of quantity quality matrix. Like, so he says, well, one reason we might see fewer kids is because people just shifted from a quality to quantity, quantity to quality. We don't like to think of kids this way, but there's a sense in which if we interpret quality of children to this time intensive, like resource intensive kind of parenting, that could be pretty off-putting. To say briefly what the women in my book seem to think was that I'll go ahead and use the phrase. It was almost, they definitely didn't have the quality or the, sometimes I'll say qualitative approach to children. They viewed them more, I've used the language of a sanctity of life rather than a quality of life. And so now when we're outside of this economic framework, we know when people say quality of life in the sort of moral or ethical sense, they have a very specific set of things in mind. Like, there are certain things that make life worth living, right? So we're thinking about the end of life conversation. There's new laws in the United Kingdom. If you're suffering, if you're a burden on other people, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's what the quality of life paradigm is, that there are certain things that we would think of as making a better life or a worse life. I would say that the women in my book rejected that kind of quality of life framing in relation to their children or in relation to childbearing. I didn't interview them about end of life, so I can't say. But in relation to their children, what did that mean for them? Is that they didn't think you have to have a certain amount of stuff to have a child. They felt that that child was so valuable to them, so eternal, so long lasting, right? So likely to bring joy to their life that it would be worth doing anyway. And that, if the baby didn't have as much education because they were going to run into the end of their tuition dollars, so somebody had said this at one point. She said, well, my husband and I looked at each other, we thought, if we have that next kid, we're going to have to take them out of private school and start homeschooling. And she's like, we both looked at each other and thought, I guess we're homeschooling. So like a very clear sort of, we know what we value here. We value the sort of the objective value of this child to us is so high that we're not really that concerned if they get so that maybe that's the way to sum it up. Yeah. So I'd say it's certainly in a general sense, rejecting this kind of like keeping up with the Joneses idea or some of those things. It would be wrong to avoid saying that I think a lot of that was encouraged among them by having grown up around other families or having, as adults, met and encountered other families with a lot of kids. Because we are so social, I think that keeping up with the Jones or like taking your cues from what other people are doing with their kids is very powerful. And so I think they often drew a lot either from their own childhoods or from the other people that they had met in their church communities, that where you kind of go like, oh, actually, yeah, my kid doesn't have like 10 devices and all of these, accoutrements. We don't have a fancy car. My kid's perfectly happy and those kids are happy. So it does take, I think, some learning that you have to sort of see it could be fine and your kid wouldn't be unhappy. Just like, as a mom, you have to kind of cross over. You're like, okay, can I take my 10-year-old through to the age of 18 with no video games in the house when I know that most of his friends have video games? And at the beginning, you kind of like take a deep breath. You're like, I don't know. He might be made fun of. I don't know. And you break through that wall and you're like, oh, actually, he's fine and it's fine. And I see that it's fine. And we only had like one negative comment. And then after that, it's fine. Right. So I think that adopting that kind of, I like to say sanctity of life over quality of life approach seemed to allow those women to sort of like break through some place where once they saw that it was fine, they were just like, it's fine. We're just not going to do those things. We're not going to have a college fund and that's going to be fine.
I love your point about role models. And as I was reading this book, I saw the women that you interviewed as like giving us a whole bunch of different role models that we can look at and see like, oh, like these women got college education, they have goals and careers and plans, and they also decided to have 5+ kids. And we don't really visually see that a lot anymore. You're an exception to that. My mother-in-law, who had 8 children, is also an exception to that. But there isn't a ton of other people I can point to. So the book is really wonderful at giving you additional options.
Right. And I think you can't choose what you've not seen, right? So if we're kind of in this moment where we want to, like, I do want to say, I want to affirm that I think it's really great that women have things to choose they're good. They're really good things. Then it really helps. It really helps to have all those various options on the table, and it doesn't look one way, right? So somebody, some college student journalist interviewed me about my book at some point. She said, "I really want to interview you about trad wives," and I said, "But that's not the subject of my book. I mean, are we clear about this?" They would look a whole variety of different ways. I'm not sure anybody that I interviewed. Trad wife wasn't a phrase. When I did these interviews, it was already 5 or 6 years ago. But just to your point, I mean, you've got like full-time physicians and, lawyers, to stay-at-home moms, to like all the spectrum in between. So yeah, we just need examples.
Absolutely. And before I ask about your lived experience, because I do want to dive into that, I want to make sure we really emphasize this policy point, because there are lots of proposals in the policy space aimed at why aren't women having kids, and that being the baseline, which you've already critiqued a little bit, but then their answers are trying to address costs often. Cash transfers, tax credits, giving women monetary bonuses if they have kids. What are your thoughts on these common policy proposals, and what are they not seeing? What are they getting wrong?
Right. So one way I've tried to frame it is, some people have asked me, like, how, what in your study led you to the conclusion that these bonuses, subsidies, cash transfers don't work? And I said, no, nothing in my study leads to that. That's 40 years of experience across the globe. Like, the countries have been trying this. What my study aims to do is show why they don't work. So just to back up, the first thing is they don't work. They haven't worked up until now. I mean, maybe people will evolve into different kinds of animals in another couple of years. Like, this is this question about how quickly we evolve. But no, they don't seem to work. So, we've got at least, I would say, conservatively 40 years of like concerted efforts in the modern era. But, you can go back. There are lots of historical cases too, where, emperors were concerned about falling birth rates. You could think about the time in France after the Napoleonic Wars, just like a concerted effort to try to raise the birth rates. And the general sense of like all of this history is that countries can definitely depress birth rates if they do bad things. Like, they can do bad things that cause birth rates to be, they can certainly like directly attack people's fertility, as in like China's one-child policy case. They can, confiscate property and be socialist. And we know that in socialist countries, people have lower birth rates. So countries can do that. They can depress the birth rate in places where people would otherwise have children. But when you try to tell that story in reverse, can they just sort of turn it around and like, get people to have kids? We don't believe there are effective. We don't have any historical examples of states effectively doing this. Right. So think about this. So basically, subsidies, bonuses, cash transfers, eligibility for special, write-offs or tax credits, they don't seem to meaningfully work. And but what I tried to do is just like, well, why is that the case? And I think the key insight there, and I quote both Mises and Buchanan on this point, is that kind of at the moment of choice, something like having a child is a binary. It's not like I'm choosing between all these different types of things at the supermarket. It's a very special kind of choice, because you either do or you don't. And at the time of that choice, you are not just choosing the expected costs, that the financial outlays that will come with that choice, but you are also thinking about the things that you have to forgo. So you have a baby commits you to not doing some other things. And that's that language of opportunity cost. And so from talking to the women, I think one of the great things about talking to women who have a bunch of kids is that they could just come out and tell you all the things that are tough that they have had to miss out on. And so that because they were so frank about that, I got like a really nice depiction of this. Like, And it brings things to the forefront of our imagination that we're not always thinking about. So, you're thinking about like a baby bonus, like, can we just get a few $1,000s in the hands of a new parent? You're thinking, wait a second, like this parent is going to be up every 2 hours with this baby for the, first few months of life. And that could go longer if the baby's not a good sleeper. And you're thinking like, who in their right mind is going to be super incentivized to do that because there's a $3,000 check coming? You're just like, wait a second, it's not that. So I guess the way I put it, it's not that incentives don't matter. It's not that you can't nudge people to do things with these sorts of bonuses. And I don't think they're a good tool for social engineering in general, but you can use them. And we know we can nudge people to buy less gasoline. If you get the price of gas higher, it happens, right? I've got like multiple family members have switched to EVs because the price of gasoline in their state is so high. We know we can change people's behavior. The question is like, how big are the costs in terms of the opportunity costs, the things you have to give up? They're pretty big when it comes to a kid. This isn't like, choosing where to go out to eat tonight. You're committing yourself to an entire lifetime of activity and action. And so can you nudge that with a couple $1,000? And I feel like the answer should be no, like, cause we're really more interesting than that. So I think some of the most ardent supporters of this kind of pronatalism on the part of governments would say, yeah, you can't nudge them with a couple $1,000. You might be able to nudge them with like $500,000. But now we're in the realm of science fiction, right? There's like no country has that capacity to spend a few million. And then we wouldn't want to do that anyway, right? Like, I don't think we would want to. Now I'm in the ethical zone here, but like, I don't think we'd want to. To me, that's really science fiction in a place where contemplating it at all, like a society in which we're just transferring. We almost set aside a group of women as the breeders and we like transfer social resources to them. Like to me, this is like not the society we want to build. Even if you could get a bunch of people to like specialize in being the breeders.
Right. Veering into Handmaid's Tale territory now.
I do think it is. Yeah, it's in that place. But yeah, for the normal person, basically the bottom line is like having a kid is a huge commitment, and it should be. It's a ton of your time. It's reorienting everything of your life. It's more like joining the army than like going out to dinner, right? It's like, I actually think it didn't occur to me till later. Like, I don't think you can incentivize joining the military either. Or I think it's hard to do it, right? Like there's a lot of bonuses, a lot of sign-on stuff. But I think at the end of the day, the people who join are people who really do see it as like a valuable life choice. I think countries outside of like, this is why they conscript and why they draft. And, it's like, I think it's hard to incentivize joining the military. I think it's that sort of a thing. It's very hard to incentivize.
So when a policymaker approaches you and says, so what do we do? How do you respond? What do you say?
Yeah. Well, depending on how much, it's like, do I have 1 minute or do I have 5 minutes with this policymaker? So, if I have 1 minute, my answer is kind of like, do the things which we know are conducive to creating a climate in which people who do want to have children can have them. Right. So don't regulate housing in such a way that it's really pricey. Don't crowd out churches. Like churches provide communities of support. They provide networks of meaning that give people a reason to do these things and opt into this kind of lifestyle it's an opt-in lifestyle. We see that churches provide, tremendous amount of support that you can't get anyplace else. So to the extent that we have to have a conversation about what it looks like to see a big sort of modern state crowding out social services, crowding out charitable works. Certainly we have a little bit, it's not as much as I'd like to see, but we have a little bit of research on the crowd out effects of the New Deal programs, and what I'm really speaking about is like the state gets involved in charity, meeting people's needs in various ways. Churches back away because the needs are being met in this other way. And then churches kind of shrivel up a little bit. They're like, what are we supposed to do? Oh, we're supposed to, kind of appeal to people for an hour on Sunday. They have a very small role in people's lives. And because they're having a smaller role, they can't shape values as much. And right. So people don't need the church as much. So I'd say to that policymaker, okay, so like get the regulations down that make the price of certain things high. And then, stop out competing the church in the space of like social services, because this seems to be clearly where people are deriving the desire to have children in a society where children are like horses, where you don't really need them to have a good life. So that's like the 5-minute conversation with the policymaker.
There is such an assumption that it has to be government solving the problem, that we need them to do something, rather than focusing on like the community aspect, the civil society aspect, and the importance that those groups can provide to us, which I think is missing.
I mean, I think we can kind of compare this a little bit to this kind of curious language people use, like government innovation, right? Like, have you heard this language? Yeah, this is sort of like, well, we know that like innovation and ideas is important for growth. And then we go like, oh, but we're not seeing as much innovation. And then they want to do something about it. So the government can be innovators. Like, so the government could, and what do they mean by that? Of course, is the government would collect tax money, or, borrow from the future taxpayers, which is more likely the case, and then allocate that tax money to, companies that seem to be like good research and development bets, right? Which is kind of a weird situation, but that's how some of these MMTers think about promoting innovation and promoting growth in the future. Never mind that like that's not generally how it happens. So you'd say like to the government policymakers, like, how can we get more innovation? Of course, you'd want to say, you have to back away from trying to do it directly, because actually you're bad at it. You never make the right bets. You're inefficient. You put all the eggs in one basket, right? There's all kinds of ways to think about that. But then you'd say if you wanted to do something at all, you have to think about the climate in which people typically become innovators. And so you'd have to think like lower regulation. You'd have to think about your education system. Like, are there ways in which we have like a monoculture in education? Again, a kind of crowding out of the educational space. There's this monoculture. We have, instead of like a whole group of people that are like doing weird Waldorf school stuff or like homeschooling in cabins, we just got one system and they learn one way, and we kind of crowd out divergent types of thinking. So you'd say to the policymaker, like, encourage the things that we know lead to an innovative people. Don't do innovation directly. And I think that's the best analog for thinking about natalism. It's like, don't do natalism directly. You can't do it. You're bad at it. And when you do try to do it, you distort behavior in ways that I think are really undesirable. But you can do like, well, what's the climate for a healthy natal population? What are the conditions that would favor more people choosing this? And that's a conversation you could have, but it requires people to think in a way that I think policymakers tend not to think, which is, your social services policy may actually be your family policy in ways that you didn't anticipate.
Absolutely. Before we conclude this conversation, I do want to ask about your personal life, because it is in the book. It is prominent. It's relevant, obviously. And I have you here. I'm also just genuinely curious. Most people I know that know you are also like, how does she do it? There's an importance to role models and having choices be visible for us. And so you have a PhD from Harvard in economics. You are the head of the political economy department at Catholic University. You're highly accomplished. You have this book that you've just published, lots of really impressive research. And I know that you have 8 kids?
Yeah, 8. That's right.
How do you do this? Do you just hire a bunch of help? Do you have a secret staff that's working behind the scenes? Like, how do you organize your time? How do you wear all of these hats at once?
Okay. All right. That's a lot. I'm certainly happy to answer as much as I can, because as you point out, it's in the book. I mention it for obvious reasons. All right. Well, I'm glad that we're not on video, because your listeners will not see me blushing over here. I'm like, oh no, you're asking the question. I think, okay. So, but a couple of big things. The first thing is just to really point out that I didn't do it all at the same time. And I think that's really, really key. So people say like, oh, you teach a lot of classes and you have this, but I didn't. I really stretched out graduate school 12 years, I said. I think it took me 12 years to finish a program that, we usually say by 6 years, like that's really the tail end. If you take 7, you've really gone too long, something's gone wrong. And so there was a willingness, I would say, when I was in graduate school to just not worry about what everybody else says and thinks about me. I couldn't have done that, I think, as easily as I did. I mean, it wasn't easy, but I do need to give credit to my great partner, my husband, who is also an academic. But I think together we were really of one mind. Like, this is more important to do while I can, and so I don't have to do this on the regular time frame. And so, we were willing to just buck the trend, I guess, and just say, like, I think this will work out. Like, there was a lot of confidence. I also want to say, and maybe this is important, one of the things that when I was in grad school, I always felt was there was a clarity about it, was that what I was most drawn to doing was discovering things about the truth, like studying, I thought of myself more as a truth seeker than as a member of a profession. And so I thought, well, if in order to have a couple of kids at the time when it's good to start my family, I get knocked off this PhD track in a way that's unfortunate. Like, it's okay. Like, I'll write books. I'll do things that do not require a PhD. It's a little bit hard to say that. I did finish, of course, and I was tenacious, and my husband really supported me a lot of the way and like encouraged me at different times when it felt like, oh, like, why should I do this? I've already missed all the marks. Like, I've missed, and I'm going to say something about that in a second. But, so I think that for people who are listening, like, a kind of encouragement to just, whatever it is that you really value, to go for it and not worry like, the things will work out, and not to worry as much about what people say about you. If you see a truth that you think is worth pursuing, like, it's okay, sell the sell the boat, sell the car, whatever it is, like, go ahead and make that happen. Now, so I said I didn't do it all at the same time. So I took a long, long time to get my PhD. I would say in those days, I didn't see myself eventually teaching and writing a book. I just thought, like, well, I'll just finish this, So to me, I'm like, oh, this is great. It did all work out, but I didn't see it at the time. Second thing, I didn't do it all at the level that I would have maybe wanted to in advance. Right. So I want to make sure that anybody listening, like, I wasn't a star student at Harvard. I mean, I was passable, and I could have done better if it was all I was doing. But, like, nobody thought, like, oh, she's the, we know who the star students were. It wasn't me. So I want to make that also clear. Like, it was, I'm incredibly grateful for the teachers that I had there and the community. I don't think I made the best use of it, and probably in a lot of ways didn't have the maturity and the wisdom to benefit from that the way I should have, because I was young and, just wasn't really clear what was going on. And then, what else? You did ask about, like, sort of maybe some logistical things. So yeah, I've worked more as my kids have gotten older. So I want to say that's, I think, a pretty steady rule for a lot of women. For me, I was very committed to staying home with them when they were little, but as they've gotten older and they're in school, so I worked a lot more since my kids are in school. And then because my husband is also an academic, we have combined flexible schedules. So one of us has been able to be home, which is a big blessing for us. So I think those are like the big general things, kind of being able to relax and let go of the normal script or the timeline, trying to keep an eye on the thing that really matters. And maybe in some instances, it may not be the degree or the certification in whatever field people happen to be in. And actually that can really contribute to these things becoming more valuable and less inflated. Because I think a lot of people pursue degrees and certificates more for their signaling value, right? Rather than for, like, what are we here for? So I'm not actually sure this is a bad idea to kind of to push people to think hard about the value of the degree versus the underlying. So I knew, like, the underlying thing I really wanted was to study and to write and to think about things. And so, yeah, finally you said, I've written this book. Well, I wrote the book, 7 years into my first tenure track job which I started when I was 40. So the bottom line here is I'm a lot older than I look, and I took a lot of time for each of these stages, but I wouldn't do it differently looking back. I'm really grateful that each thing has had its time. And so now, now that my kids are growing up and they're actually moving out of the house already, getting married, it's a great time to be writing books, and I'm already thinking about the next one. So
the last question I always ask my guests, if someone wanted to dive more into this topic, what would you recommend? Any scholars, books, podcasts, public thinkers who would you recommend? In fact, actually, I interviewed Dr. Deanna Thomas about the market for childcare, and she recommended this book, your book, Hannah's Children, in her answers. So I am curious, additional resources for people if they're interested.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I think this is other book, which is kind of the complement to mine, which is called What Are Children For? Complement in the sense that it's a philosophical treatment, but it's really looking at the other side as like people who don't want to have children and examining those deep reasons. And I think their work, this is Rachel Wiseman and Anastasia Berg, super interesting, very different approach, but also uses a lot of qualitative work. And I think they kind of come to really, they're not economists, but they come to pretty similar conclusions about kind of choice and decision. It's really quite interesting. So I recommend that book. Kind of a different read, a little bit darker. Yeah. So I think Tim Carney's book, Family Unfriendly, in terms of like just the bigger picture of like what happens when the society moves away from children, it becomes, I think that's your point about like everything looks harder to do and you have to put so much into it. I think his book has a lot of interesting insights. He's a Washington Examiner columnist and works at AEI, scholar at AEI. I think that's really great. But you know, maybe I'll just go ahead and say it. Like I've been really informed by reading a lot of historical fiction in my lifetime. And so if this is not a bad moment to recommend to your listeners, for me, the work of Sigrid Undset, who is a Norwegian woman, an author, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. I think her work really does focus on the kind of the drama of decision, but it's so beautiful and interesting and looks at medieval Norway. So her book, Kristin Lavransdatter, Daughter, was really formative for me. And so, yeah, maybe that's like a really offbeat thing, but actually like that's the kind of person I am. So I think we would benefit a lot by actually like studying other times. And so I started reading that when I was young and I've read it multiple times. And I think it's just a terrific work. And she's really interested in the question of like what women are doing and like what shapes their whole life course, from norms to religion to sort of family and social obligations. So she's got a couple of great books, but that's the one that's my favorite. Kristin Lavransdatter Daughter. And there's a great new translation. Well, it's probably 10 years old now by Tina Nunnally, Nunnally. And you can of course find that on Amazon. So that's really offbeat. I probably wouldn't have thought I would recommend that, but yeah, I think it's great. You won't put it down once you start it.
I love that. I'm definitely going to check that out. So thank you so much for the recommendations. And thank you so much for joining this conversation today. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.